Hello and welcome to our second masterclass for Waterline Pro. Now you may have guessed in this case, we're going to be building a bit of an underwater scene and we're going to be using our more advanced volumetric fog system for that now. This involves quite a few settings to mess around with, so it is a bit more in-depth and more complicated, but as you've seen, the results can be quite great looking. So for starters, we're just going to build a standard level, pretty blank. Going to start with Unreal's default lighting system, dropping in a directional light for the sun, an atmospheric actor. In a bit, we're going to add a skylight and height fog. And yeah, in the beginning, we're just going to make sure that pretty much everything is set to movable and dynamic. We're not really doing anything too groundbreaking at the moment, just sort of placing everything around the 0, world location so we know where everything is. Here goes our volumetric fog. Now we're going to set the density to something really low because, well, we just need to have this actor in it. And if we set it to 0, then, well, we're not going to have any volumetric fog. But if we set it to 0.001, we could still use the features of the volumetric fog without it being actually there. Now, depending on your project, you could still have it on to something a bit higher. But yeah, this is kind of a way to clamp it almost to underwater. Now we've placed our ocean and we're just kind of playing a little bit around with the lighting, trying to find something interesting. We're not going to spend too much time on this in this case because our scene will be mainly underwater. So what we're just going to do is up the resolution a little bit, just get a bit more wave resolution and quality at the start. We're going to add in some micro displacement for extra details. And we're just going to play around with the values a little bit, nothing too noisy, but just enough detail that we have something pretty high quality that we could just have above ground. And this is looking pretty good. And yeah, the amplitude is a little bit too high. We're kind of playing with the wave peaks. And yeah, this is pretty much what we're going to go with, I reckon. We're just going to execute a couple of console commands. Rejection flickering set to 0, tone mapper sharpened to 5, just so we can get a higher image quality without any blurriness from the temporal super resolution. Next up, small adjustment to the wave speed so it's not too erratic and too fast moving. We want to get something believable. So something around this case seems to be looking pretty good. Now, if you've seen our previous tutorials, yes, we can take the above ground visuals much further, but yeah, that's not something that we'll be focusing here. We're just going to adjust the FOV a bit more so we have a larger sort of viewport, a bit more nicer to look at. And let's go underwater. So you may have noticed that this is our default non-volumetric underwater VFX. These do look pretty nice, but we can take them to the next level. So you might be seeing a little bit of a round artifact around the bottom of the edges of the screen. Don't worry, we'll be getting rid of that a little later as well. So because we'll be using volumetrics, we really should also use caustics because these look great. That's what gets us those rays moving underwater. So we're just placing a really big plane just so we can basically preview the effect. And next up, we're going to start enabling our more advanced features. So for starters, let's start with our volumetric fog. We're going to enable that. And there we go. We have volumetric fog. Now, it still needs a few more adjustments before it can look great. And next up, we're going to open our post-process material and tell it that go into volumetric fog mode because some of its advanced features will clash with the volumetric fog. So now things are looking pretty much correct at the moment. And next up, let's just get our caustics in order. So we're going to go into Ocean VFX, Ocean Caustics, and these are basically done via a light function. So we're going to be creating a material instance of one of our pre-existing ones. or rather just quickly duplicate it and then modify it as needed. So let's do this. And fog, whoops, this is a caustics material, so not fog. And now we're gonna get that light function and place it into our directional light, basically our sun, and set our sun to movable. And let's see what happens now. Not much, because we need to enable our caustics in our ocean actor. So under caustics, enable FFT caustics, and oh boy, it looks horrible. Now at the moment, we're not going to use dynamic caustics for our scene, but a quick way to stop the horrible flickeringness is to enable atmospheric sun. And next up, we're just going to change up the tiling a little bit because our caustics texture basically as tiny as noise. So right now we pretty much have the effect running and some pretty horrible artifacts that we'll be fixing up in a bit. So once we're happy with the tiling of the whole effect into something a bit more realistic, its scale can be set independently from the ocean simulation. And yeah, at the moment, the way we have it set up, our caustics pattern is directly driven from our ocean simulation. Now I have a couple of filters to sort of adjust the quality and maybe add a bit of blurriness so we don't see the individual photons in our simulation of the caustics pattern. And yeah, once we're kind of happy with this, we'll be adjusting it a bit more later on. This is pretty good for now. So next up, let's do something about those horrible temporal fog artifacts, if you will. That's basically that little bit of a whiteout we see when we move from under to above the water. And the quickest way to do this is to adjust some console commands, but there's quite a few of those. And we've basically just got a little blueprint actor that you drag and drop in your level and executes those console commands. So now you could see that this horrible smearingness is pretty much gone. You can just open up this blueprint actor later on if you want to see exactly what it's doing, but it's kind of really nice balance between performance and quality, and it's specially tuned for underwater volumetrics. We're making some smaller adjustments to it later. So for starters, let's get some volumetric scattering intensity with our sunlight, so it's better reacting with the volumetric fog. And right now we're seeing that things are not looking great. So something else that we really should be doing as well is add in another one of our little helper blueprint nodes. So we already have one for the volumetric fog. So let's add in another one. So we're going to go and search for the light direction blueprint. And that is basically an extra little small blueprint that kind of talks to our caustics effects. So right now, that kind of also adjusts our subsurface scattering a bit, and it looks terrible because we dropped it. But the way to set it up is to copy the rotation of your directional light and paste it into this little blueprints rotation as well, like so. And there we go. The subsurface scattering looks nice. The underwater caustics are going to look nice in a second. So once we got this, we're actually going to be disabling atmospheric sun. And there we go. It looks pretty rough at the moment, but for the most part, our effects are all there and they're all rendering. So let's focus up on making them look even better now. So one way to do this is to get more voxels in our scene near the camera. And to do this, we're going to be limiting the view distance of our volumetric fog. Now for our initial preset, we're going to be going for somewhat more realistic visuals, and that involves higher quality rays and fairly limited view distance due to the fog, so more practical about what you would see in the ocean. Later on, we're going to try a bit more of a stylized approach with a longer range that requires quite a few adjustments and is a bit more taxing to get it looking nice. So for starters, let's change our shadow maps to virtual shadow maps. So our shadows look very nice in our volumetric, so we don't need to mess with those as well. And for that, we're going to enable Shader Model 6. And while we're at it, just so we have everything to play around with, we're going to set our RHI to DirectX 12 and enable ray tracing in our project. So we're just going to do this now quickly. And yep, we're going to be also restarting our engine in a minute. So now that it's all good and done, we've opened up our level after the restart. And let's get rid of that horrible error message. We have forgotten to set our skylight to movable. So let's do that. And to get rid of it, we're just going to change our sky atmosphere to stationary and movable and back to movable again. And everything is looking pretty good at the moment. So yeah, pausing it, we're having a little bit of a horrible flickering from our rays. So let's do something about that now. So if we lower our view distance too much of the fog, we get higher quality, but we're also starting to get a little bit of a horizon bleed. And that's something that we'll be covering in more depth a bit later on. So for starters, let's adjust our seafloor a bit, get some more depth into the scene. And now we're going to be So we just made a few small adjustments to our underwater volumetric fog blueprint. Let's adjust our screen resolution. And one thing to note, basically what we're changing here is, here's a quick look at what's inside the blueprint. Basically a bunch of console commands. And what we've done is adjust our volumetric fog light function resolution. We're gonna bump that up a bit and we're getting a much sort of better looking image. Now, something to remember is that volumetric fog grid pixel size has a huge impact on the visuals, but it's also extremely heavy. For real-time projects, we would recommend keeping that at 256 or 512 at most, certainly nothing higher than that. And grid pixel size actually depends on your screen resolution. In this case, we're recording on a 4K screen, and when we hit up to 100%, we can basically drop this value down now to 6 to get a more consistent looking rays, because you may have noticed that they looked a bit too fine and a little too sharp. And something else about that blueprint is that it has a separate code for upon begin play. So if you're changing the values in the construction script, you should also change them in the events tab. Next up, let's change the scattering distribution of the exponential height fog. So it's a bit more reactive near in the direction of the light. So we're getting a bit more forward scattering rather than back scattering. So now our sun is looking a bit more realistic. And while we're at it, let's change that horrible gray looking water surface. So open up the water surface material, change it to blue for underwater surface color. And now we're just going to play around with the values until we get something that blends a bit better with the environment. I think this is pretty good looking at the moment. So maybe something like so. And yeah, overall, this will do for now. So next up, something you may have noticed is that when we look up, we cannot see our sky. It's just a big black box. Now, this is a pretty annoying bug, but it's one that can easily be fixed. So for starters, we need to make this very simple material. This is basically a blank material with these two nodes added to each other and plugged into a emissive. So just to be safe, leave the blend mode to opaque, not unlit, because we do need some depth from this material. And sometimes unlit materials do not output depth. And we're just going to grab this and put it on a sphere. So we're just going to grab our sphere here. And what we're going to do is basically stop it from casting shadows, stop it from affecting distance field lighting, and collision. We basically want this sphere to be pretty much non-existent anywhere besides sort of purely visuals. And we're pretty much done now. Nothing for indirect lighting for us to worry about. And finally, we're going to type in ENV here, and we're going to get sphere with inverse normals. This comes with Unreal Engine, so it's basically an inside-out sphere like so. Now, we're going to get our material and drop it onto this sphere. And now, when we look through the material, you could see our sky. So we've basically recreated the sky material pretty much exactly as it is above the ground, but in our sphere. And we've placed our sphere and made it really big. So, yeah. Now there's some small changes in the brightness, which you can account for in the material itself if you want. But because this material basically is placed on a sphere that provides depth information, we no longer have that horrible circle artifact around the edge of the camera that we had at the beginning of the video. And now the world above the water is actually visible as it should be. We're just going to make some small adjustments on the skylight, but volumetric scattering really doesn't seem to work for it, and we don't really need it to cast shadows. But we're going to set the cube map resolution slightly higher. Now, this you don't really need to do that, but yeah, it's something of an extra quality setting that you can do. Next up, let's start making changes to our volumetric fog and start messing around with those colors to make it even better. So the defaults are pretty good, but they can be better. So for starters, let's see, what are we gonna do? Now, to go over our volumetric fog solution, we basically have a sphere around the camera that is that has no fog in it, and past that there's a very sort of harsh edge that has very strong fog around it. Now we're basically controlling these with the background fog. Background fog solid is how strong this background fog is, and the distance and the transition, well, basically how strong that transition is. Now, for inside that sphere, we have this other parameter called extinction, and that's what is basically controlling the strength of the rays. Now, the rays are again fog, but this allows us to sort of have lesser fog near the camera and then a sort of sharper drop-off. So we can have a bit more better control over background visibility and the rays almost as a separate individual kind of entity. So adjusting the albedo will kind of adjust the color and intensity of the rays themselves without too much of an effect on the rest of the fog. So right now, the way we've set them, the rays are looking pretty interesting, kind of gloomy. And next up, for our albedo, let's just bring up a bit more brightness from our rays. In terms of emissive, we've added a slight emissive property to our fog just to simulate an environment with lots of light scattering, which is basically the underwater world. How everything is going to be slightly tinted blue by a bounce light from this really big sort of solid medium. And that is what that is. Next up, we have sky blend, sky follow, and sky shift. And that is the sort of upwards tint that you're seeing, this sort of gradient that we're playing with. And that is the sky emissive, and we're blending it with the basically emissive there. So now we're going to kind of adjust these until we're happy with what we have, some kind of a nice sort of depth to the overall thing. We can go with some pretty much any color you want for either of these. So let's see, something a bit brighter and maybe a bit softer blend, because now it's a little bit too harsh. Now the workflow of this is ideally you would first set up your fog density and the strength of the rays and then fine-tune these colors and gradients. And now we're just kind of pushing this background fog a bit further. And yeah, this is looking pretty good at the moment. This is pretty much the setup we have for our volumetric fog map. So if at any point these steps appear that are too much or too difficult to set up, don't worry, this comes pretty much preset as we have it here. Finally, we can make some small adjustments to our underwater post-process material, but because it's in volumetric fog mode, it works slightly differently. So for starters, it doesn't have, oh, we can adjust the waterline color again. So let's make it something a bit darker here. And yeah. And next up, we have a bit of a sort of depth tint with fog range and fog transition and color multiply and contrast and so on and so forth. And we can basically use this as an almost underwater red filter, which is used in a lot of underwater photography. So basically, the farther something is from a camera, the more tinted blue it becomes. Now, this is a pretty subtle effect and is not technically physically correct, but pretty much every underwater reference photo you will see might have this. So let's just play around with these color values a bit. And right now you can see that when something is near the camera, it's its original color that it's supposed to be. And the farther it goes, it's kind of being tinted more bluish. So we're gonna play with this a little bit. And yeah, setting this up right now will really sort of pay off slightly later when we're trying to create a more realistic sort of a scene. So now we're just looking a bit at the rays and how everything is moving, and things are looking good. So now we're just going to make a few small changes to the caustics pattern. We're going to change the filter to something like 0.5, so we're not filtering out a lot of the more neutral values, and we're going to lower the spread a bit, so we're getting a lot more detailed sort of look to our patterns here. Now it is important to note that we also have some pre-made patterns here. You don't need to simulate this in real time. We have a small library of flipbook textures that you could also use. And we're going to also adjust what we're doing right now is the filtering settings a bit on these, so the photons aren't as visible. So this is looking pretty good. Now this is a sort of worst case scenario where they're on a sort of white surface that's perfectly flat with no pattern whatsoever. So these will look a lot better later on when we start filling up our scene with some basic textures. So let's do that right now. So we're going to import a couple of coral textures that we quickly made, and we're going to make like a super quick material called for Seafloor. And yeah, let's grab those and throw them in. So we want to make this look nice with a sort of least amount of work. So what we'll be using is a palm texture or a parallax occlusion map. So let's get this really scary looking node. And for starters, our height map, we're going to convert it to a texture object, and we're going to plug it into our height map texture. For height ratio, we're going to go with something low like 0.05. This is a good starting point. Minimum steps, the default is 8. I personally like to have something like 1, just so the effect at its minimum is very low or better. Now, there are some more advanced ways that you could process these numbers to make the effect look better, but we're not really going to be focusing on this right now. So something else, I do want these textures to be in world space, so don't worry about tiling and blending objects together. So I'm going to grab absolute world position, just a quick divide node for the tiling, and that's it for our UVs. For height map channel, let's just set it to the red channel. And reference plane, we're going to set it to 0.5. So our height map is sort of being told to go up and down. So parallax UVs, we're just going to connect these to our color and normals. For some extra controls, we're going to add a flattened normal node here, so we can play around with them a bit more. And this is pretty much the setup we're going to use. So for roughness, ideally, made a small mistake here. We should have set this to 1 and specular to 0.5. But this is looking pretty good already. So just going to create a quick material instance and place this on our plane. And there we go. It's looking pretty good at the moment. Let's just open up the material instance, start making a few tweaks. So this is looking a bit too dark. We're going to brighten this up in a minute. But as for the tiling, we want to increase this a little bit. Set our specular to 1 ideally should be the correct value that you would want to go here. And 1 for the roughness. Oh, specular should be probably 0.5. We're going to adjust the normals here a bit to make them a bit more harsh, to make our sort of corals and underwater critters and rocks just stand up a bit more. And overall, it's looking pretty good. Now, this is just a quick material, just so we have something to work with, to play with colors and stuff later on, just to we have something nice to look at. We're going to be adjusting the depth a bit, bring it a bit more to the camera. And yeah, overall, it's looking pretty neat already. Something that we're going to do is grab this large plane and just make sure it's not casting shadows or anything like that, because we really don't need it, and it can be a bit taxing on the virtual shadow maps. It's not something we really need or use anyway. You can take this a step further by adding some pixel depth offset and some contact shadow stuff to this. But for now, we're just going to be adding a small color multiply node just so we can adjust the brightness and maybe give it a little tint. So let's do this quickly now. And we're going to hit apply. And now everything went black, but that's because we just really plugged in a 0 node in our multiply color. So let's just fix this right now. And set our value to 2, yeah. So a bit more brightness to our texture. Maybe add in a slight bluish tint, just to really blend it in with our environment. But we don't really want to lose this really nice color that we have here. So yeah, things are looking pretty good. So next up, let's play around a little bit with our underwater surface. So a couple of extra things that we can adjust is basically the scale of the underwater refraction, or as some people would call it, that big hole through which light comes in, and that is basically the underwater refraction ratio. So yep, that's something you can very much control. So this is looking quite good actually, the way it is. Creates the effect of a shallower looking thing. And underwater surface boost will also add a little bit of a multiply to the world above the water, so we can have it a bit more blown out or a bit more easier to see. So right now, these are kind of looking okay. So let's roll with these. And finally, something really cool that we could do is make a few adjustments to our post-process actor. Now, we don't have one in our level, so let's just quickly add one. So post-process volume, we're going to drop it into our world 000, and we're going to make it unbound so it's affecting the entire scene. So next up, what we're going to do is look for the bloom and set the intensity really high. So the reason we want to do this is we want to make the visuals a little bit blurry, like you would expect underwater. We're going to also adjust the threshold, and yeah, things are looking pretty horrible at the moment, but something that we could do is just simply lower the brightness. Now, doing this through the viewport is a little bit of a cheating, so another way we could do this is, again, through the post-process material by adjusting things like the exposure, or in our case, we're going to be going under, I believe it was color correction, color grading, and gain. Now, there are a lot of ways you could do this. In our previous video, we did this through a color lookup texture. Yeah, we're really not going to be exploring too much about color grading here, but it goes very in depth. But for our current sort of purposes, this is looking pretty good. Come to think of it, let's return this sort of above world. Yeah, this is looking pretty good. And a small tweak to the overall depth of our seafloor, just so we're getting a little bit of a fogging to it, not too bright, and maybe increase the scale of the texture a bit. And yeah, this is looking pretty good. So now we're going to have a small look at different sort of variations based on what we've kind of covered already and how we can make different sort of moods or lightings, and later on how we can expand the underwater fog range. So, yep. And this is pretty much the same scene. We've just kind of created a different material with, well, it's basically the same material. We've just kind of changed the textures a bit with something a bit more darker, realistic, kind of decayed looking coral. And let's start with our volumetric fog. Now we're going to create another version of this material and slot it in here and start making some changes. So for example, maybe we don't want this kind of blue sort of pristine look to it. Maybe we want something a bit more shallower or muddier, or maybe something with a bit more sort of green algae floating about. And let's see how we could do this. Well, it's pretty simple. For the most part, we'll be just playing around with the colors that are already here, like the albedo, the emissive, so on and so forth. So we're rotating this will allow us to sort of change the color of the volumetric rays. And we're just going to play around a little bit with the brightness, and this is pretty good. And now by adjusting the overall sort of emissive, we can also adjust the, as we mentioned, the overall scattering of color underwater. And now we're getting this kind of really cool, warmer, neutral looking rocks. We can play around with it a bit more, but what we had just a second ago was quite good. So something along the something like this, a sort of nicer looking blue, and at the same time a warmer color is a nice sort of contrast that we can do. So again, just kind of doing a more or less a hue shift here, just to see what works and what looks better. Finally, we can also go back to our underwater post process and adjust some of the color settings in there as well. So maybe we want something a little bit kind of warmer. And this is looking quite an interesting sort of sandy kind of look. It's almost like there is sediment near the ocean floor, and above it the water is getting a bit clearer. So moving a bit higher though, this makes the effect a bit harsher, so we can play a little bit around with the values here to blend it in a bit better. And also with the sort of range and transition of this sort of color grading step here. Maybe we can adjust the color so it's not that harsh. And let's just push this sort of transition way out, and it is looking a bit better. Something like this. Again, as you can see, you could adjust this to your liking as much as you want. There's almost no limitations. You can get even crazier combinations if you go with not unbound post-process volumes, but just ones that are kind of localized based on maybe depth or camera position. But for the time being, we're just going to be making some finer changes to the underwater color. So if we were to go for something now a bit more sort of greenish kind of tinting, this is how we would do it. So we're kind of playing with the volumetric fog colors, the underwater post-process colors as well. We opened up the wrong material here, I believe. We enabled use light function caustics by mistake. So that's what happened there. And so yeah, now we're creating a sort of darker, murkier looking waters. We could play around a bit with the emissive and the volumetric contribution from the directional light as well. But this is a bit of a sort of muddier looking delta kind of look that we can achieve. We can also adjust things like color intensity and contrast from our underwater post-process material to make it look extra nice. But for now, this will pretty much do on that end. So this is kind of like something that we're happy with in this current scenario. Now we can play a little bit around with the extinction to make it a bit more murkier. And yeah, this is looking pretty good as well. So yeah, sort of muddier looking delta water or something a bit more shallower beach that's kind of have a bit more washed up sand. But yeah, through these color combinations, you could get pretty much any look that you're after with this in terms of underwater visuals. So yeah, what if we want to create an underwater scene with view distance that is quite large? So for example, this would be pretty much the best approach for pre-rendered animations or something like that, because it can get a bit taxing to sort of support this kind of level of volumetric ray quality over a larger, well, distance. So for starters, let's just create a couple of pylons here and place them quite far from the camera, and then we could kind of use these as reference points for the water clarity that we are after. So we're just going to build up a couple of these at various depths and ranges, and we can see a slightly better sort of look at how some of our parameters for the volumetric fog work and all the different places and adjustments that we could tweak them from. So this is looking pretty good. And yeah, this is pretty much our current preset, which we would recommend for real-time projects. It's kind of being done to be as realistic as possible. So not too far of a view distance really, but realistic in terms of the real world. So let's see how we can push this. So for starters, let's start adjusting our background fog distance and blend. Sort of start pushing this farther out. So, whoops. Let's make the blend a bit harsher so we can see what's going on. Now, something else is that our current underwater extinction is quite high, and that's actually doing most of the work here. So if we set it to something closer to 0, the inside of that fog sphere becomes more transparent and we could see its edges a bit better. So once we start adjusting these though, some of our other color settings for the lights, as you can see here for our skylight, will also need adjusting as they can get a bit too bright. So yeah, adjusting the fog and sort of its density is kind of like the first step that we would recommend doing, and then fine-tuning these. So now we're just kind of messing around with the fog. You could kind of see the fog sphere coming in and out. And past a certain point, you could kind of start seeing the water horizon, and that's not something we want. So to fix this, we're going to be adjusting the view distance of the exponential height fog, the volumetric part of it anyway. And this is pretty much what this setting does. So for quite a high sort of distance, we want to increase this number by a lot. So by the end of this, we'll be actually going with some even higher values. The problem is the higher that these values are, the lower quality the volumetric rays will be. We can compensate for those, but that kind of is just done through a bit more raw computing power at the moment. Now we're kind of looking at the shadows and how things are looking nearby and far away. Let's lower our sky emissive to something a bit more manageable so we can get visuals that are basically on par to what we had before, and sort of adjusting the blend a little bit. So yeah, this is pretty good looking. And now we could see the really far pillars pretty well, but we could also see a little bit of that horizon. So increasing the view distance even to 10,000 isn't quite cutting it at the moment. And to work around this problem, we're going to have to make some smaller adjustments to our ocean blueprint as well. So now you could see that we're pushing the far fog away, but it's kind of being cut off. You could start seeing like this kind of round hole through it. And what we basically need to do is, let's just increase the distance here. So going super high is general. Yeah, you could kind of see the issue here quite clearly now. This is the reason we left this segment. And what we need to do is select our ocean actor, and you're going to find a component called volumetric fog canvas. Basically, we need to increase its X and Y scale. So we're going to go with something like 100, but you could go with something even higher if you want, just to be safe, like 500 or 200. We'll end up increasing it again by the end of this video. And that basically took care of our sort of horizon bleeding problem. And now we're looking quite happy with our distance fog. We are getting there. We're going to lower the extinction even more. And things are looking good. We're kind of basically seeing the shadows of the cylinders against the harsh fog that we're now adjusting. So I've kind of left it a bit too harsh at the moment, just so we can see what we're doing. And once we're kind of happy with the range, we're going to be adjusting the blend now, so we have a sort of smoother transition. And this is looking quite good. And now we're just going to push it up out a bit more. And now you could see that those pillars near the bottom are just kind of blended in a bit better with the fog, and we are getting this kind of distance as well again. So let's increase that volumetric fog canvas size a bit more, and the exponential height fog maximum range. Let's try something really high, like what is it, 20,000? I think we're gonna try up next. First of all, let's see if adjusting this number can fix it. So it's not quite clear if this is showing up on YouTube, but there's basically a little white line beneath the water that we're trying to get rid of. So let's go with something even higher for the volumetric fog canvas, and the line is still there. So we're going to have to increase our volumetric fog distance. There we go, something like 20,000, and the line is now fixed. So 20,000 is a bit too harsh, so let's see if 15 will also do the job. So this is looking quite good. Now, ideally, you'd want to have this number as low as possible without this sort of a horizon bleeding artifact. So you could fine tune it a bit more. So let's bring in some of our near camera fog, if you will, and that's going to automatically start blending all the sort of fogs and lighting effects that we have a bit better. It is going to lower our clarity a little bit. So let's just boost up this volumetric fog albedo so we could see the rays a bit more. This is looking quite good at the moment. We could see that the things that are, all the sort of V effects are holding up as expected. There are also some settings that you could blend away these effects with camera depth. We're not really going to be going over this at the moment, but just something that you should know is that things like underwater rays and sort of colors can be adjusted with depth. So now this is looking quite good. We're just fine-tuning our background fog, and we're going to start adjusting the emissive, so it's looking a bit better. And things are looking pretty much the way we want them to. So we have some near camera rays, some volumetric shadows from these objects. And yeah, so for example, if you have something really massive like a submarine or an underwater temple, this is kind of like the sort of parameters you would be using just so you could see larger underwater structures. Our albedo might be a bit too high at the moment for our rays. So let's just lower that a bit more, because for time purposes, let's just assume that our camera is going to be at this sort of height. And yeah, so next up, we're going to be looking at sort of fixing up our rays, because you could see at the moment when we move, they really shimmer in a horrible way. And realistically, to do this, we're going to be going into our underwater volumetric fog and adjusting this sort of parameter that's our volumetric fog, light function, blah, 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 super sample scale. We're going to set that to 50. And once that is in, when we move the camera, whoops, let's bring back the rays and make them a bit more obvious. You could see that now scrolling does not cause this sort of shimmering effect. So other things you might want to adjust is those parameters we previously went over, like the grid scale for X, Y, and the Z grid Z scale. Lowering that from something, a value of 6 is actually pretty good, but maybe increasing the other value to something like 2K might be necessary. Just be warned, 2K is extremely high and should be used for sort of pre-rendered scenes. It could crash Unreal. So what we have at the moment is a pretty good balance of visuals, quality, and performance, and range. We're getting some really high, larger distances underwater, and things are looking pretty good. So just a quick demonstration now at the end. This is the kind of results that you could get with what we previously had, just kind of adding in some basic assets with the volumetric fog, and everything is looking pretty nice with rays bouncing off of them and them casting shadows. So yeah, hopefully this has been an inspiring kind of video for you, and go make awesome things.